My name is Brent Notbohm, and I'm a professor of film and video at the University of Wisconsin-Superior. And today's coffee break course is on how to interpret a film. Now, that's a really big subject. There's a lot of different ways to interpret films, to read films, to understand them. I teach an entire course on this. In fact, I've taught several courses on this particular subject over my career. So we're going to focus on just a couple of different elements and apply it to a popular film from the 1990s that I suspect quite a few of you are familiar with. To begin our discussion, though, I want to start by talking about the difference between form and content. Now, content is what we're all familiar with. It's what we tend to talk the most about when we talk about movies. It's the story, it's the narrative, it's the characters and what happens to them. When we describe movies, we usually describe it by their content. But the form is how that content is expressed. And you can't have one without the other. The form of a movie is really how it's presented. How that story is presented to us impacts our experience from the first moment to the very end. And we're going to get into a discussion of form and how to read form here in just a couple of minutes. To understand the difference between form and content, I sometimes think it's good to use an analogy. And so I like the idea of a window. If you look out a window, what you see outside of that window is, of course, the content, right? It might be a view of Lake Superior, for example. But the frame of the window itself, where it's positioned, the glass, maybe the curtains, all of that are aspects of form. It frames what we see, and maybe as important, it frames what we don't see, as framed out of that particular perspective. And so form and content is an interrelationship that's crucial in the understanding and interpretation of movies. So let's talk specifically what are some of these elements of film form? And I've listed the four basic categories here: mise-en-scène, cinematography, editing, and sound. And mise-en-scène is what we're going to focus mostly on today, but mise-en-scène is the staging or all of the elements that we see within an image. Cinematography tends to be the more technical aspects of how the camera films these events, and lighting and lenses and all of these kinds of more technical components. Editing is a crucial concept of film form in which images are cut together to convey meanings, to control pace, and a whole host of different techniques. I'll point out a couple of examples in the clip we're going to watch here in a couple minutes. And then sound, of course, is crucial: music, dialogue, etc., in the presentation of a story to us. What's really interesting about the study of film is that form is often hidden from us. We don't see it directly, but it has a very distinct impact upon our experience all the time. And filmmakers, of course, utilize these elements of form to impact our emotions, to tell us key things about the story, and so forth. So I'm going to give you a quick example, and then we'll move on to a more specific discussion of mise-en-scène. And the example here is this image from Citizen Kane. And this is a moment that happens early on in the film when Charles Foster Kane is just a young boy. He's actually seen here in the background of this image. And this is an image that uses composition, specifically the foreground versus the background, to express notions of power to us. This is a moment in which Charlie Kane has just become one of the richest people in the world because a gold mine was discovered on his mother's boarding house property. And so she's determined that the best way to bring him up is to turn his estate and himself over to this banker, Thatcher, seen here. And so this transaction, really, where Charlie Kane is a little boy here, is sort of being purchased by Thatcher. This transaction, the foreground is where we see the power, right, with the papers, and mom here is making this choice, and Thatcher here is sort of the person that's getting Charlie Kane in this transaction. Dad is an insignificant character and is quite literally framed out of this image in just a few moments after this one takes place. And the least amount of power is in the background here, little Charlie Kane, framed in a window, almost like an object that's being bought and sold. And so just in this brief frame, you can infer a whole lot in terms of what's happening in the world of the movie. It's one of the reasons why Citizen Kane is such a famous film, in large part because, of course, every image of Citizen Kane is very dynamic, highly expressive in terms of its elements of film form. But all movies do this to one degree or another. And so for this particular class, we're going to focus primarily on the notion of mise-en-scène. And for mise-en-scène, the term is probably one that most people aren't familiar with, roughly translated from French means putting on the scene, but basically is a term that we use to describe all the things that we see that are important in an image, the overall look and feel of a movie. Sometimes it's called the staging. And there are two key components of mise-en-scène, design and composition. Design is the props, the settings, the lighting, even the actors, the casting, the clothing they wear, their hairdo, makeup, all of that is part of the design. And all of that's chosen very carefully on the part of filmmakers to impact our experience, to present to us this make-believe world, to make it as real as possible for us as the audience. The other key component of mise-en-scène is composition. And we just looked at an example of that from Citizen Kane. Composition being how actors are presented within the frame, right? So organization, distribution, balance, basically the use of space in an image, in a frame. And composition is one of the key elements of, what academics like me call the cinematic language. If you put this together, one of the really fun things about understanding film form is to begin to read more consciously the mise-en-scène, and therefore understand how these elements contribute to your interpretation of the film. Now, it's important to understand also that you do this unconsciously. Filmmakers design movies and craft them very carefully with intentions in mind so that we experience the film emotionally, even if we're not conscious of the way in which the elements of film form are impacting us. But if you step back and kind of look at the form, read the form more consciously, you'll see how this really works. And so for our example, we're going to use the introduction of the notorious and infamous serial killer Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs. One could argue that this scene that I'm about to show you has led to an entire franchise, multiple movies about Hannibal, a TV show. There's even a new TV show about Clarice. And it's in part because of the effectiveness of this introduction of Hannibal in the Oscar-winning 1991 film directed by Jonathan Demme. And so I'm going to play the film, and as you watch it, I'll kind of talk about a couple of key elements of mise-en-scène and even of cinematography and editing to pay attention to, and we'll talk about them in more detail and provide a little more interpretation of them on the other side of the clip. So here's the introduction of Hannibal Lecter from The Silence of the Lambs.
I'm going to show you why we insist on such precautions. On the afternoon of July 8,
notice they're heading down some stairs. That's interesting.
His mouthpiece and restraints were removed for an EKG. When the nurse leaned over him, he did this to him.
Now, this is very interesting. You'll notice the red light in this close-up here. We see Clarice's reaction to this picture of some horror thing that Hannibal did, but we don't actually see the picture itself. That's also very interesting. Again, noticing the red lighting here, an important part of what's being communicated to us about where Hannibal is held.
You might have suggested this in my office and saved me the time.
So then I would have missed the pleasure of your company, sir.
When she's finished, bring her out.
Now, you'll notice here, this is very interesting. We see Clarice look off frame, and then we see this image as it pans across the security room. That's an example of a point of view shot. There's going to be a couple more key point of view shots as she walks down the hallway towards Hannibal in just a moment. But you'll see also that this helps us to identify with Clarice as the film's primary protagonist, right, as its main character. Point of view is one of the key components of the cinematic language. We see through the eyes of characters in movies quite frequently.
He's past the others. The last cell you keep for the right.
Now you'll also notice
I put out a chair for you.
this creates suspense. When Clarice walks down the hall to meet Hannibal for the first time, pay particular attention to how it's kind of drawn out, and the three other inhabitants of this cell are presented to us. Of course, the ominous music is also a key factor. This guy in particular is grotesque, right? All of that creates this anticipation for this moment.
Morning.
Good morning, right? So let's spend a moment here and we'll analyze what we just saw from The Silence of the Lambs. So the initial image is Clarice and the doctor coming down some stairs into this red room with these red bars. Well, what does that suggest to us? What is being expressed? That this is a descent into hell, because hell is the only place where these horrific serial killers can be kept, right? And so it's a metaphor. It's an effective metaphor that is presented to us subtly, or maybe not so subtly now that I pointed out to you, through the mise-en-scène. Also, this moment where she's looking at the photograph where we see her reaction to this horrific thing that Hannibal has done, but we don't see the image of that directly, places it within our imagination. It's kind of a clever choice on the part of Jonathan Demme to activate our imagination, of which this entire scene is really doing. Then you have the security room. She looks around and it's creating suspense, right? It's sort of drawing out the eventual introduction of Hannibal. We see the guns, we see security. We recognize that he's a very dangerous person. When Clarice begins her walk down the hallway, the three other inhabitants of this place are monsters, almost literally. In fact, the final guy is crawling on this cage that contains him in a very monster-esque type way. And so as each of those three previous creepy crawly serial killers, as I call them, are presented to us, we must think by the time we see Hannibal, he's going to be the worst. He's going to be even more, monster-like. And instead we get this image of this seemingly pleasant man with immaculate posture. He's not even behind a cage, but behind glass, right? And seems very polite. Could this guy actually be this horrific, serial killer? And so it's part of how the filmmaker Jonathan Demme is playing with our expectations, with our emotions, and creating suspense throughout the scene. Now let's also think about this image and a couple of other key points. Let's talk about the setting. And you'll notice these sort of bricks in the background. Now it's important to realize that there isn't a prison in the United States today or a mental hospital in the United States that looks anything like this. This is all a product of design, right? Because it's a dungeon. It's being presented to us as a dungeon, which is of course fitting for a descent into hell, where a terrible serial killer like Hannibal Lecter would be kept. We don't even treat the worst in our society in the way that this film presents them to be. And you'll also notice that, we have some paintings here. His cell seems relatively clean. I mentioned the posture. He looks very well groomed. And you think that Hannibal is just a normal guy, polite, Englishman. But there's something about this image that suggests there's something more ominous to us beyond the surface of things. If you look very carefully at Hannibal's face here, you'll notice that his eyes are in shadow. Now, one of the basic tenets of cinematography is to always get lights in the eyes of your subject. And in this example, Demme and his cinematographer, Tak Fujimoto, have clearly decided to leave Hannibal's eyes dark, something called raccoon eyes, which in most cases is considered to be bad cinematography. But here they do it intentionally because, of course, it gives Hannibal a mask. So this polite demeanor, where he's humanized because he's not behind bars, but instead he's behind glass, and his great posture and his polite manner and the great performance by Anthony Hopkins is all but an appearance. that his true evil self is hidden behind this mask, behind these eyes, right? So we've just interpreted The Silence of the Lambs, which is, I think, a really dynamic example, of how films communicate emotions and meanings to us. Now, if you look at any film, you'll be able to see how mise-en-scène, how these aspects of form express certain ideas of the movie to you. So next time you watch a movie, or for that matter, a TV show, pay particular attention to the form and ask yourself this question: what's being presented to me? What's being expressed by the filmmakers in the design of the film, in the composition of the film, with the cinematography and the editing? And it's a way to, sort of a whole new way for a lot of people to interpret a film beyond just the story, but to see how it works, and therefore to celebrate film as an art form.